Well, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Betty Sweetman to the podcast. Betty, welcome. Thank you very much for joining me. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Thanks for inviting me. I'm really thrilled to be here.
Excellent stuff. So, you are an indirect procurement leader and you've got some great experience in the industry. You've worked at some really interesting places and done a few kind of slightly different angles along the way.
Mhm.
Do you want to just, for the benefit of our audience, do you want to just give a little bit of introduction to you, your background, and kind of your journey through procurement thus far?
Okay. Well, I actually didn't start in procurement. My bachelor's is in business administration, but I focused on transportation. So that's where I started my career journey, early days. And transportation, global logistics. I worked for several companies that were engineering and construction, high tech, in a variety of different roles, all related to more of the back end of supply chain, the warehousing, the transportation, which I'm really glad I started that way because it really gave me a practical understanding as to how supply chains really work. So, and see where procurement fits into that whole scope of supply chain. Um, Over time, I moved into to roles related to travel services. Just kind of a quick aside, I always treasure the conversations that I have with people that have helped me along the way. And I had no aspirations to get into travel management. But I had one person that said, I think you'd really be good at this. I've got this idea over here and this job that I think would be perfect for. And so, voila, I ended up immersed in managing a travel program for a big media company. And then I was able to parlay that into roles at Genpack, excuse me, at Amgen, and then managing the travel services role at BP. Um, from there, I had another one of those conversations with someone else that said, "Hey, at Amgen, you had experience at contingent labor as part of your responsibilities. How about you come over to GE and manage our entire contingent labor program for all of our businesses? We're consolidating our business and we want to be able to manage it all under one consolidated program." I said, okay, sounds interesting. Wow. I fell in love, quite honestly. It was, you really understand from that immersion that contingent labor is one of the things that makes the world go round. It's all about the people that do the work. And I think it's a forgotten group of people that don't get benefits from a company, but they do a lot of work for a company. I was always surprised at how many people came into a contingent labor program versus the employee count. So, all of that support is so important to be able to establish and look at what's available across the business. And the other thing I learned in that position was that contingent labor is not paid through HR. So it's a budget line item that is managed by stakeholders, which was an important piece because while there were no more hires, there was budget to bring on people for projects and do things that needed to be done to continue moving forward for the meeting the business expectations for the functions that we worked with.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think I love the fact that you mention some of the kind of colleagues and mentors along the way that have kind of helped you steer a path. I totally agree with you. It's those conversations that make a light bulb go on, or it's somebody that recognizes something in you and says, "Hey, you know what? Have you ever considered X or Y?" I think that's so important in many people's careers. Certainly something that resonates with me, and yeah, you always hold a sort of bit of a soft spot for those people along the way, don't you? It's quite critical.
Absolutely. Absolutely. They're people I go back to and that remember me fondly, which I always appreciate.
So,
Um,
so that just a couple of points on that. Within GE, you were obviously doing the contingent workforce side of it. Did that cross over into the services procurement side of things as well?
It did in a way because of some of the buying channels that we had created related to contingent workforce. And one in particular was a buying channel we created with a workflow process for engineer their GE's engineering services. That in an engineering environment, they're working on products, but they really don't have a lot of sourcing activity. We needed an outlet for a requester that needed a project with people to be able to move it forward, get a good contract in place, and then be able to execute on that scope of work. So we set up master agreements and an SOW workflow for GE to be able to make that happen. And it was quite successful for the businesses that chose to use it. And then when I went to Genpact, we weren't able to use that same workflow. That's when we decided to go and look for what was in the market. And that's where our introduction to Zivio came in, to be able to bring an AI-driven tool that would support that buying channel. And that was an important piece to be able to then at Genpact provide that service to multiple customers. And we had some really good successes with it, and some customers didn't want to go to that level yet. They weren't ready for it, but then we had others that were like, "Yes, let's go," because we really want to move forward with one AI based tools, as well as being able to have that human in a loop to be able to guide their folks through the SOW process for a successful outcome.
Yeah, it's so interesting, and it is amazing for people like you and I that are kind of on the sharp end of this when it comes to the whole services procurement part of that workforce conversation. Some companies are scared to move. They stick to they might not have they might have a very poor situation, but they're sometimes fearful of moving out of it. And I think that's something that will only change over time. It's the same with the AI side of it. For some people, they're being very cautious with it, but that feels like that resistance is being reduced almost on a weekly basis. Um,
Yeah.
it's moving very quickly. I mean, having just been at ProcureCon in Vegas, the amount of conversations and the way that they're advancing around the use of AI is just incredible.
Yeah, I would agree. Last week, I was able to go to an ISM local chapter meeting in Houston, and they had their guest speaker was a one that's playing big in AI space. I won't name the company, but so they were able to give us a demonstration of what their tools do. And I think it's all pretty. I think it will work well, but I sitting in the chair, I felt a distinction between what is category strategy and strategic sourcing versus operations. And at Genpact, we had a very different operations group that once we did the contracts, the stakeholders and those customers, the way they process POs, all the way to the AP process as well. That was the sweet spot for AI. And I think that that's going to be a piece that continues to grow and evolve. I think that the pieces that are more human in the loop, like creating strategies, are going to benefit by having the ability to be able to get good data, get market intel in a much different way, much quicker than in what we had been doing in the past on going to multiple locations just to find market rates for labor, for example, or engineers or project rates or legal or whatever the services were. So I think that that's coming, but I haven't seen any evidence of that really taking place to be able to help a category manager yet. I think if anything, that's the piece that's going to be a little bit behind. But the operations side, man, it's going full force, and it's really exciting to see.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, as the availability of data and the sophistication of the organizations being able to manipulate that data, I think that's going to then feed through to the strategic side of it, where people are looking at forward planning, category strategy, supplier strategy, all that sort of stuff is going to feed out of it, because for a lot of organizations, where their start point is just very little data or very poor data. And so they're kind of stuck at this point in the moment where they haven't got the efficiencies in place or the capture in place to be able to leverage that. And as you say, the impact that AI has had, I always say it's had two major impacts on services procurement. One is it's kind of taken away the excuse of organizations and departments saying it's just too complicated. Large amounts of unstructured data, lots of variation, giant scopes, hard to write scopes, hard to measure, compare, all that sort of thing, hard to define stuff. Well, AI takes away a lot of the excuses there because it can be extremely valuable in those workflows. But the other area where it's had a huge impact is empowering or enabling technology providers to make the user experience better. And I think that's the critical thing. You can put technology and tools in place, you can try and engineer great processes, but if people don't follow them, it obviously doesn't work. So that for me is the second one, is just that user experience now with modern tools, especially when you've got dedicated approach to whatever problem is you're trying to solve. AI can be very, very useful at helping out in all the different areas just to make that journey much easier. Just like we see if we're using an internet browser these days, where you've got Copilot or Google Gemini helping you along the way, or whatever it might be. It's becoming integrated into how we do stuff these days. And I think it is enabling some great leaps forward, which, as you say, is very exciting. But just going back to some of the some of the stuff that you've worked through, a question that springs to mind, just bearing in mind today's, let's just say, complicated geopolitical situation. Having worked in the logistics side, having worked through COVID, looking at it from a supply chain angle and a procurement angle, the more and more chaotic the world seems to get, it seems like the more important procurement and supply chain gets.
Mhm.
And in terms of, in your view, do you think that is helping to kind of elevate the profile of procurement and supply chain within businesses in general?
I think so. And two examples come to mind. So, one working at BP, I was there at the time when the Deepwater Horizon event happened in the
Wow.
Gulf of Mexico. And I remember the day distinctly because the travel team was working on tracking the travelers that were impacted by the volcanoes in Finland. The day that we were ready to report out our final to senior leadership, I remember sitting in a room, and the senior leader that we were reporting out to was called out to the hallway. 10 minutes later, he came back and said, "Clear the room, good job. You look prepared to be able to bring everybody home." And then Deepwater Horizon started. For my group, for the indirect sourcing team, we were all hands on deck to, one, make sure business continued so there was continuity, and then provide the resources needed to be able to get people to the sites, to be able to get them hotel rooms, rental cars, those kinds of things, as kind of an all hands on deck. So I think that one gave me a lot of insight to risk management, the value of the relationships you have with suppliers, were much more intense and necessary than it was price. You didn't want to be gouged. You wanted to pay a fair price, but you wanted to make sure that you got either the boom in the right place, you got you got a system going. It was hurricane season as well, so we had to plan for hurricane season. So that kind of event really helped me look at sourcing services differently. So that brings me to my second one, at GE, was just a matter of transition. It's 9 companies with almost $1 billion in contingent spend. That's temp labor spend.
Wow.
That wasn't, we didn't get our arms around the SOW spend that was across all the businesses until GE decided to buy a VMS tool. That helped, but it still didn't get to that process. So that measure of transition also taught us a lot. And I would say that what we had done in terms of category management was to put a strategy in place that was an annual strategy with projects, but we also put a 3 to 5 year overview outlook. What did they want? How do we reach total talent management? And along the way, we did find some opportunities to highlight that there are some good wins here. For example, we were able to use the temp labor data as just from the MSPs to be able to look at tenure and location. So as a result of that, what we were able to do was to look at those that had a very long tenure, sometimes as many as 15 years. So we were able to look at that and say, are you sure you don't want to bring them on as an employee? If you value them that much, then think about that part of it. We were successful in being able to mitigate some of that risk by either replacing or ending their tenure or their relationships. The other one was to look at the data and look at location. How many were in mid-cost countries that could go to best cost countries? So we were able to kind of lift and shift to move groups of people with suppliers that could manage at a best cost country position, which made our sourcing leader for that business very happy to be able to see that we were able to lift and shift. It was a boatload of work, but I think those were some of the progressions towards looking at total talent management. That if we didn't have the data and we couldn't identify them, they helped us to be able to do that. So, good relationship developed with stakeholders to be able to make that happen and look at what the options are and the opportunities are for them to be able to shift to source differently, to think about their workload differently, to think about risk differently.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating when you look at the work that you've done, there's this interesting crossover between procurement and contingent workforce. And this kind of, you mentioned it earlier, you said looking at the concept and the opportunities with contingent workforce headcount versus full-time employees and the restrictions that may exist around one that enable the other to compensate, for example. And what you said is something that really resonates with me. Is you said it's important for the organization to be able to understand what is available across the organization. And that for me gets to the very heart of it, really, with regards to total workforce management, total talent management, strategic workforce planning, for the executive team to be able to say, what is the most effective use of our resources? What's our capacity? What's our capability? We have to do work to deliver either our product or our service to the market, to our customers. And that's going to be full-time employees, it's going to be contractors and temps, maybe freelancers, maybe gig workers, definitely services procurement. So this is where we're getting into the really interesting stuff around the mix, and how this becomes truly strategic for an organization. But you and I know in terms of maturity, if you look at something like contingent workforce, that's been a fairly well solved problem in terms of service provision, technology, and things like that for probably, well, it's been going on for a good 20 plus years. And it's a pretty mature level for a lot of organizations. When you get into the services space, this is where it's far less mature, the statement of work, services procurement stuff. But that kind of comes into one of the first points that I wanted to discuss with you, which was something that we've spoken about before, which is this evidence of a shift in some cases from a contingent approach to more of an output and outcomes deliverables based approach. And I think, as you said to me before, that ties into the bigger underlying shift from kind of like a contingent labor mentality to more of a total workforce mentality. But what is it for you that is making that visible, that shift? And what for you do you think is driving that behavior, if that's something you're seeing happening?
Well, I think as I mentioned before, we put together a category strategy that was, on yearly increments to be able to determine which sourcing projects would take place. But it really was that 3 to 5 year outlook that was total talent management. We knew that it was going to take the businesses some time to be able to get their head wrapped around what total talent management meant. Um, and uh, and I think to this day, as I mentioned earlier, that split between where the budget sits is a big part of that. HR, all employees, they don't want to talk about total talent management because they've already managed their total talent of employees. So one of the things that we did in our strategy was to make sure that we started to execute on the different variations. So contingent labor, temp, the independent contractors, freelancers, and the SOWs. So those were the three that we focused on. So I think in that consolidation, we had a really good handle on being able to bring the temp labor population to place. At a person that at GE that had developed a workflow process for SOWs. Very successful. He was able to not only put a workflow in place that shortened the amount of time for processing, but he was also able to grab the data in a way that a VMS tool couldn't grab. So we decided to continue on with that buying channel and not use the one size fits all that an MSP is offering. So we separated that out. And then lastly, we also did the same thing for independent contractors. There's that unique need for independent contractors. I think some of the challenge in the scope of work and the independent contractors come with who manages the budget. The function manages the budget. So they're going, each function, that's where that partnership comes in so heavily to be able to make sure that one, you can sell them, that procurement can help them. You have to demonstrate that over and over and over. And then you have to have the data across a pretty long period of time to prove that it works. And it was successful. It wasn't successful in every client at Genpact, with the exception of putting together a strategy with a hope and a prayer that they might get to total talent management. But again, that was a business decision that as they were going through transition, they weren't ready for it yet. So I think there's some businesses that are ready, and I'm sure there are several that are functioning in the same way, that are looking at those three components and putting it together. But that, I think, is where the evolution that we're going through with AI is going to be able to help a lot. And I think from our last conversation, the pieces that you showed me about what you're doing on the supplier side, as well as all of the back end milestone reporting and all of that, give that more context to be able to prove that what was bought and paid for was received, and that the company got good value from being able to go through that process and have a good result from that SOW. So I think there's a movement afoot more towards I would say a guided buying channel specific for SOWs, all sorts of SOWs. I will say the last SOW that we put through Zivio for one of the clients at Genpact when I was there, really successful opportunity. The stakeholder involved had literally hated working with sourcing. It was very cantankerous. He was just very difficult to work with. And we said, we're going to do it anyway. And lo and behold, it was an enormous success because of the savings and the collaboration that was evolved to be able to turn him from an adversary to an ally. So it was, I think those kinds of stories, get out, leak out, say, hey, wait a minute, we did this over here. If we can do it for a tax department and we can do it for engineering, who are very, very different, it's an opportunity for others to try it. And some of their either most, their best partnerships or some of their worst.
I love it. That's a brilliant example. I think one of just going back to what you were saying earlier about that taking that total talent approach, ultimately, if you've got all of the data across your different channels, you can make an assessment. You can then strategically evaluate that and start doing planning and predictive analytics. Obviously, the data is going to be different. Several of those channels are going to be individuals and time, and that is well handled by the kind of VMS landscape. They're designed for contractors, temps, to a certain extent, freelancers, but it's all people and time. Obviously, when you get into the deliverable-based projects, that could be a block of consulting allocation. It could be a sprint in an agile process. It could be project deliverables. It could be works where there's, it's a telecoms installation. So there's kind of like professional labor involved, and there's also items involved. So it gets more complex. So you start having different types of data to compare, but that's not really the problem for most organizations. The problem is they don't have that data, particularly in services. I had a really interesting conversation with Lisa Williams from Dow Chemicals recently, and she was talking about that within their strategy, and they've got quite an evolved situation. again within the engineering services side of things. But SOW was the bit that was missing. That they couldn't do total workforce management because there was one channel, one fundamental channel that wasn't there, and it's such a big part for organizations now of their overall capacity and capability. It's like 50% of organizational spend is that broader kind of services procurement. So it's kind of crept up on organizations a little bit in the sense that it's just become bigger and bigger and bigger. But without AI, it was a very thorny problem to try and solve. But that's now nowhere near the case it was even 2 years ago.
Mhm.
And I think it's really a bit of an awakening for some organizations to understand the kind of art of the possible, which was fantastic to see what you and the team were doing at Genpact in getting out to people and being able to bring that into their organizations. But just coming on to the latter point you made there, I love it. Tiger teams. I hear that, quite often. Bring in the difficult characters. Bring in the ones that are going to be a most opposition for what you're trying to roll out. And if you can make it work for them, then you're really in a good position. And that's certainly something I've heard from a few organizations. So it's brilliant to hear that that was something that you came across as well, because you really have to solve the problem for people like that, don't you?
Definitely, definitely. And I also see that procurement's role is evolving to not only advisory, but to oversight. And the as you were speaking, the example of another client that we worked with at Genpact had created quite a mess for the company because they allowed the supplier to have too much control. So as we went back to that budget discussion, those budgets that are held by individual senior leaders, they're going to spend their money the way they want to. It's my budget, leave me alone. But they were all different, trying to meet the same end. So what the company had done was to put together a BPO contract with one supplier, and then they just SOWs were going in. There was no control. No one knew how much money or people were involved with all of those SOWs. So when we started to kind of look around the corner at the data, we also found that same people were working on multiple projects over and over and over again. Tenure then became a problem. Risk then became a problem. Outcomes became a problem because no one knew what the outcome of those SOWs were. No one, in fact, we had some that SOWs that were still stuck in somebody's drawer. So I think that that oversight role, once we pointed those things out, it's like, well, here's some real obvious problems that need to be handled. But procurement can help you not only source, but have that oversight role so that you can do your business and function as you need to, and we can help you with that and support the outcome of that by giving you data that you need on the outcome of the SOW itself that you've negotiated. So let us help negotiate first and get the right terms. And then second, let's put that oversight in place to be able to get controls over it because it was pretty messy.
Yeah, and you bring up a great point about the fact that the outcome in a services engagement can be a kind of a movable feast.
Yeah.
And with regards to SOWs sitting in somebody's desk drawer, oh, absolutely. I mean, metaphorically, quite often it's, just a scan signed PDF dumped in a SharePoint file or somebody's file folder on their computer, which may have milestones or deliverables in it, if you're lucky, but they might have changed. And if they're not captured digitally, you can't see that process of knowing at all times what was promised versus what was delivered. Exactly as you said, in terms of assessing performance, did we get value for money? It's just something you hear all the time. Just the simple thing of capturing changes within a services project can cause so much harm for businesses and actually I would say suppliers as well,
Yeah.
where suppliers can sometimes get blamed for overruns and extensions, where actually if it was audited correctly, there might be visibility that actually that project took twice as long because the internal stakeholder didn't scope it correctly, or they were off ill, or people weren't turning up to meetings, or whatever it might be. So, it's you need to be able to cater, you need to have flexibility in services procurement because things can go many different ways.
Yes, very much so, very much so. So if I look at the evolution for procurement, in that 3 to 5 year period. I think, of course, AI is going to be prominent in that procurement operations. I think the pieces that are going to still need alignment are going to be category strategy, partnership with the businesses, understanding that business budget impact, and then taking AI where it serves best, but that's the piece where human in the loop still needs to stay. I can't foresee a procurement operation or a procurement function without at least a good, solid category team to be able to put those strategies together. And a flow to be able to execute on them to make sure that the stakeholders get what they need.
Yeah, and I think it's moving procurement professionals away from transactional work
Yeah.
towards more strategic thinking. And people can dedicate their time to that higher level activity. Um, so when you were talking earlier about, we were kind of talking about tiger teams and dealing with stakeholders that maybe are quite, will reject that approach from procurement, where procurement are trying to say, let us help you. And they're just trying to kind of put up a bit of a wall and say, just leave me alone. I want to do it how I've always done it. Um, in terms of the adversaries that can sometimes butt heads with this, when it comes to services, what are the different kind of key adversaries that you've seen in these types of situations? And what do you think is the key to bringing them together to make sourcing successful?
Well, I can think of a couple of examples. I had an example at Amgen with somebody that came into new to their HR team, and they basically told us, "Go away. We don't need your help. We are subject matter experts. We know exactly what we need. We know how to go get suppliers. We know how to negotiate pricing." So I had a conversation to support my category manager that had reported to me at the time and said, let's go see if we can just set up time with them and break the ice. And we'll use some different tools. We'll use a different approach rather than we're sourcing, we're here to help. We're going to use a different approach. And we used a couple of tools that basically put a mirror in front of them to say, okay, let's talk about your current situation. What don't you like about what's happening? And that was surprising because although they said that they were experts, they had a boatload of stuff that they didn't like about their current situation. Like, okay, so we got through that. That was probably a good hour conversation that helped cleanse and show the light on what they didn't want. And then to the next stage of it was to identify their target state. What did they want the program to look like? And then after we kind of had a kumbaya moment and said, yeah, we hate this, we want this. How do we get there? So that's where we started to develop a phased plan that was mutual. We would help them with things that we had control over, and they wanted to do other things but they put it into a project plan and were able to execute on it. Um, that one stuck in my head because after an hour and a half conversation, we walked hand in hand. And we were able to execute on what their needs were. And man, that really felt good. I've had a couple of examples of that where you can go in and kind of show that mirror to them on what they don't like, what they want, and how do they want to get there. And I think that's been my most effective tool throughout my career is it's a situation target proposal. It's a simple problem solving tool. And I love that tool more than any because it does highlight so many things that are opportunities for a business function. It also shows a light at the end of the tunnel on how they can achieve what they want.
Yeah, I love that because it's basically it becomes a true problem solving exercise. You're
Yeah.
focusing on what's the pain here, and it's very interesting the way you described it as their initial approach was, I don't have any pain, everything's perfect, and that's something that I've seen many times within organizations, and within services procurement, we use our tool, the Wheel of Pain, which just talks about the kind of key problems that people come up against in services procurement. And that is the thing that really gets through to people where they look at it and go, actually, yes, misclassification is a real risk for us, or yes, scoping is an absolute nightmare, or we can't track changes, or we don't have standardization in contracts. Whatever it is, it's actually the pain that is the most important thing to focus on. So I think, I totally agree with you in terms of that is how to provide the best service to a stakeholder in whatever situation it might be, because not only are you understanding their pain, but you're helping them understand it as well. So I think that's a critical part of it. And you talked about relationships earlier in procurement. That's one of the things where the human in the loop side of it is always going to be extremely critical and just getting more important. And I think, you mentioned about building those stakeholder relationships. But I think I then also look at it and go, well, do you know what? That supply chain, those suppliers, those relationships are becoming more and more and more important the more that organizations rely on these external suppliers. And the more data you have, the more closely you work with those suppliers, the more you can make assessments of who your best suppliers are. And the more opportunity that gives stakeholders and procurement within an organization to say, we need to really stay close to these guys because they are helping drive our new product development or our bottom line growth or whatever it might be. So I think that relationship side of it, as always with procurement, can never be underestimated and never be overestimated.
Yeah. One of the things that I did for myself early on in my career was to go through intensive coaching training. I thought maybe one day I want to be a career coach. When I went through the training, I found that there were so many elements that applied to a business that I pull from those tools regularly to be able to work with the stakeholders using coaching techniques. And I think for anybody that has gone through any kind of coaching training, not just career coaching, but coaching training, to be able to ask the questions, to get to the heart of the situation, to understand what someone wants to become, what a function wants to become, what they want to achieve, and then a plan for how to achieve it. It's well worth the time and effort to be able to change a mindset from activity driven to coach. It's a different place to come from in those stakeholder relationships.
And when you look at the kind of way that you're managing relationships in these situations, particularly if we take sourcing, that's that's kind of a coaching mentality really across the board, isn't it? In terms of you're trying to smooth everything out and get everyone to gel together and see the bigger picture, which I think for a lot of people in organizations, that's one of the big problems is they're not necessarily either thinking about the bigger picture or they're not being kind of steered towards it. I don't know whether that's something that you've come across at all.
Absolutely. I think that in many companies, I think there's a disconnect between what the business does and how the support functions can support that. And I also think that supply chain is used as broadly to define, a subset of a lot of activity, all which affect the business. But I think I appreciate that there's a lot more emphasis on the overall supply chain. I also appreciate that there's emphasis in some of the organizations like Procurement that give the emphasis to procurement and our role in that supply chain. So kind of coming back to my early days, that I got to see the supply chain, but I also got to see how procurement plugs into that supply chain to make it function well.
So another area that I'd like to come on to and get your take on is this whole topic of services. I used to always say, probably 2 years ago, that services procurement is the biggest thing that isn't a thing in procurement.
Yeah.
In term in terms of the fact that I feel like it is way more of a thing now. I'm seeing way more people with job titles that are services procurement, and people talking about services procurement and all of that spend that sits under those generally kind of statement of work, output driven contract types. And it's so massive and it goes across so many categories that one of the big problems has been in a lot of organizations, there's no centralized responsibility for it. And I think that is a little bit like the fact that in a lot of organizations, there's no central responsibility for total talent management, strategic workforce planning. It's like, where does that information all go? And you're going across the workforce side of it and procurement. And services sits in a little bit of a grey area to a certain extent, in the sense that it is procurement's world, but it's also part of the workforce stack. It's part of that capability. So, yeah, it's interesting to see how that is kind of coming through in the way that people are trying to deal with this. But it feels like it's much more of a conversation now where people are recognizing it and saying, this is a huge area of spend for us. This is something that's absolutely strategic about how we get work done. And there, companies are wrestling with how to kind of get that in a proper, focused view. And it's. How have you seen that change over time? Is that something you've seen people kind of working towards addressing?
Yes and no. I would two functions come to mind that I think are really challenging in that complexity. And add to that, I think HR is, of course, the top one. In trying to put together category strategies for GE and for our clients at Genpact, we realized that there were over 20 subcategories, all with their own industries. That complexity makes up all of HR, but you've got, everything from benefits brokers and insurance brokers to learning and development to anything that's any service that's provided for an employee. And then on top of that, you've got the workforce solutions that are, SaaS tools, Workday, all of that, that are all built for employee management, for the most part. And I think that because they're in different industries, that disconnect takes place. So even within an HR function, you've got a leader responsible for relocation, you've got a leader responsible for learning and development, another one for for benefits administration, another one for so it's very fragmented all under that umbrella of HR. It takes a good CHRO to be able to look at the whole picture. But even at that, there are some places that they don't even want to touch. Learning and development's a great example of that. It's one that has a lot of different suppliers to it. So I think that there are some opportunities for sourcing to be able to go in and have that conversation about, hey, did you know that you spent this much here, this much here, this much here? Where's your focus? How can we help? But at the same time, you're also running against that same adversarial relationship, particularly when brokers are involved. They want to deal with a broker. Broker does great consolidated sourcing, but they're reticent to bring procurement into the picture. But I think that's changing. It has to change. And I think that just this conversation, I think that there is hope that they'll see HR as a function. We'll see that it's not just employees, that it is broader base that they need to pay attention to. That insourcing can help because they're the ones that have been managing it for quite a while. The other one that comes to mind is legal. Legal is in terms of not only an adversarial relationship because that's the majority of what they do is negotiate contracts. But litigation is an important piece in terms of how sourcing can come in for litigation. That's another area that I perceive can be helped, but there's probably a bit more work that needs to be done on a more holistic strategy for legal, because it's a lot of their activity is not run of the mill day to day. It's a lawsuit was issued, filed, and you have to bring resources to manage that lawsuit. So those things make it inherently messy. So I mean, of all the categories, I think those are the two messiest within the services categories. But that also means that there needs a level of expertise on the sourcing side to be able to know how to talk to a broker, how that conversation will go, managing it with the stakeholder, helping the stakeholder see that there's a partnership, a three-way stool to be built here to be able to manage better, more effectively with better data. But I mean, it's kind of for some companies, it's a hope and a prayer. truly is the long-term goal. But if you don't look at that as a goal for the future and have it in mind, then you're just going to continue on with doing what you're doing. I think it'll be interesting in terms of the AI trajectory, how those kinds of complexity problems are going to be resolved, because it does come down a lot to relationships.
Yeah, I think the job of AI is to resolve complexity and provide data in a lot of these situations, if you kind of really break it down. Um, but in terms of the categories, you're absolutely right when you talk about the variation and the breadth of services categories, which is why services procurement is becoming much more a thought process for organizations now, where they're thinking like we're buying these things in the same way, in the
Mhm.
sense that we're paying an external service provider to deliver some sort of service, which includes, expertise, IP, people doing work, and sometimes stuff around that, that is delivered on an output or outcome basis. So that
Mhm.
that is fundamentally that SOW concept, which is actually quite simple, is fundamental across all of these categories. They all have
Absolutely.
their nuances and they require their subject matter expertise. But when you look at those categories, I mean, for us, we typically see that like IT services will always be one of the biggest areas of spend for a lot of organizations. Engineering services as well, particularly in that kind of engineering type sector, automotive, aerospace, sometimes areas like oil and gas, for example. Um, what do you see as the categories that you think will kind of be able to set the examples for other categories to follow? Because it doesn't have to be like a complete cookie cutter approach, but ultimately it's still managing a services category, it's still managing statement of work engagements. Do you think areas like IT services and engineering services will be easier for organizations to get things moving in?
I think so. I think engineering services definitely, because they're already in that specification mindset. They know they have a project, they know what they need to do, or they're developing a product, they know what they need to do. The issue that we had with engineering was for them to commit on paper what they wanted and really think through all of the elements of the SOW for a good outcome. So I think that there's some transition that can help with engineering services. IT, I have to say I don't have enough exposure to it, but the comment I have is that a lot of IT solutions are owned by a function. Let's take Workday as an example. It's owned by HR, but the sourcing generally is perceived to happen in IT. So, it's a good sourcing, but the user base is over in this other services group that has to be able to pick it up and implement it. So one of the things that we did at Genpact was to align with the IT team to be able to say, okay, you guys got the ball for the SaaS or the tool or whatever tool was needed for this, but we need that intermediary and that coming together to execute on the implementation. So that worked well, but I haven't seen that work well in every company that I've worked for. I think IT has there's a mystique about IT, about what they do, but yet at the end of the day, everything they do supports a business function somewhere, and there's a business owner that benefits from their work, but still needs that transition.
Yeah.
Procurement can help with that.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you talk about that potential disconnect between the sourcing side of it and the actual delivery of what it is you're procuring. And yeah, I mean, one of my colleagues literally released an article on that today, talking about the importance of managing the whole process, because you just don't get the full picture otherwise. If you
Mhm.
don't scope it correctly, and you and I have done loads of work around that in terms of how AI can help organizations scope far more effectively and far more rapidly. But if you don't scope it correctly, you're on a loser to start with. If you don't undergo a proper sourcing exercise, you're leaving money on the table and you're not necessarily using the best supplier. But with the best will in the world, all that great upfront stuff up to the point of contract can be wasted if it's then not managed downstream as well in the delivery phase. And I think it's interesting where you see that. In some organizations, procurement, I've seen it many times, will kind of shrug their shoulders and say, well, that's not our problem at that stage. But ultimately, in terms of procurement delivering value, it's about the value that the organization gets from what it's procured, not just the initial purchase. And that's particularly true in services where stuff changes along the way. Organization chooses consultancy A over consultancy B because consultancy A have got a cheaper day rate, but then they take twice as long or they don't do a good job. And it's never as simple as just buying a thing, buying as one of my industry contacts always says, widgets and digits. You know, it's kind of like buying stuff is more binary. The supply chain is very complex and inherently has all these issues with it. But the thing you're buying, it's easy to define, it's easy to measure. It's even if it's a complex thing like an engine, you can still define it.
Mhm.
Whereas a service is this kind of thing that's difficult to pin down, more intangible in nature. So, so yeah, I think that connection between sourcing and delivery, ultimately, that is where the business is going to really drive value in terms of understanding it.
Absolutely, and it's the value of the supplier relationship. So we didn't issue any SOWs at GE or at Genpact without having an MSA for terms. You know that anchor, being able to define what the basic agreement is, and then start the scope of work based on calling off services from that MSA. That structure was really important to us because we always had that anchor to go back to. That said, we know that we had several SOWs that just the stakeholder forgot to mention something when they, when the negotiation. So, at least you've got a smaller anchor to be able to say, this is what you said you were going to do on the project. This is what happened, and this is the recourse to make well. And I think, those two pieces combined work so well together. It also lays the ground for the continuing procurement operations piece for PO issuance, change orders, those types of things to flow through the system for the invoices to get paid. So it starts from that good relationship as the big anchor all the way through to the procurement operations teams.
Yeah, and it's better for the supplier.
Yeah,
If yeah,
yeah.
if there's like you say in terms of making good, it's a joint effort, isn't it? It's working towards the same outcome. But just going back to the kind of the difference between the approach, the mindset that is required when procuring goods, materials, kind of more that direct MRO space versus services. Something that you and I have discussed before is about how for many organizations, the structure of their procurement organization is very much geared more towards that kind of direct goods and materials, MRO type approach. I've got some views on that, but from your point of view, why do you think that is?
It's an interesting question because I wouldn't consider, while MRO isn't considered an indirect category. It's always kind of the red-headed stepchild because it's all about SKUs. It's more closer aligned to direct than it is indirect, but there's so many SKUs that the on all the subcategories within MRO that I understand why a lot of companies do bring it into indirect. Do the same principles apply for indirect or for MRO as that they would for more services related, like delivering consulting services? There's a disconnect for me in how that uh, alignment on the procurement process happens for both of those. They're two very different. Can they be managed under the same function? Yes, but there has to be an acknowledgement that they're very different. So,
Yeah,
with IT, I think most of the organizations I've worked for have IT and covered under indirect, partly for the same reasons, is that it's complex and messy, and indirect seems to collect the messy and
well,
pursue them.
yeah, I find it so interesting. So, I mean, and one of the things that I see in the market is the conflict that can arise around the just the very concept of direct versus indirect. And obviously, important connotations to the way that the business is running itself from a finance point of view, from a procurement point of view, an operations point of view. But it's just direct and indirect don't mean the same thing for all organizations, because if you get a manufacturing organization, the direct spend is going to be mainly goods and materials, and the indirect spend is going to be services around running the business, is it as a kind of a very broad generalization. But if you take a global building consultancy, their direct spend is all services because it's, engineering consulting firms, architecture consulting firms, construction consulting, all of that stuff. That's all their direct spend. And their indirect spend is goods not for resale, for example. So I find it's really interesting in terms of procurement has this structure that's either, well, it's usually both of a direct versus indirect and a category strategy. And for me, coming at it sort of externally from a technology point of view rather than a procurement practitioner angle, I tend to look at the problem solving exercise of what's the way in the things that organizations buy are contracted. How are they different? How are the things that they're buying different? And for me, that always, again, very broad generalization. Goods and materials, so things are procured in a certain way, people are procured in a certain way, and services are procured in a certain way. But I feel like the way that the procurement world has grown up has been very much driven by coming out of that kind of manufacturing boom. And I personally think that it's a technology issue as well, because if you look at the way the ERP was developed, and then how that then grew into the procurement suites, the source to pay platforms, the procure to pay platforms, that grew out of a primary need to manage goods and material resources for manufacturing. And I think while that has grown up and really proliferated out across all industries, it's still very predicated from my angle towards goods and materials, primarily in terms of that Amazon experience, catalog buying, guided buying. The thing is easy to define relative to its complexity, but you can define it, you can measure it, you can compare it. When you throw services into the mix, as I said before, it's kind of the opposite. The supply chain's not as complex, but the thing is really complex and hard to define. So that kind of messes up the technology model to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Um,
That's,
and it just leaves organizations in a situation where they kind of pushed it to one side or tried to make it round peg, square peg in a round hole type of thing. But alongside that, at the same time, the reliance has shifted much, and the emphasis has shifted much more towards services, much more of a services-based economy. If you look at that shift over the last 15 years, massive shift. And actually the spending on services is growing at 5 times the rate that the spending on goods and materials is growing. So I think that the technology, we went through this kind of digital transformation in procurement. It didn't, services got left behind because it was too difficult at the time and maybe not important enough at the time. And I feel like now organizations are trying to play catch up with that. So I do feel that it is that I can certainly see a technology angle to it as well. And I think the way that organizations buy things, I can see some organizations moving more towards a view of this is how we buy people, this is how we buy things, and this is our services component, because it's just become too big to ignore for
mhm.
organizations now. And if you're in insurance or finance, it might be 90% of everything that you procure, for example, which then has that kind of disconnect with the manufacturing world.
Yeah.
Um, but I think that creates opportunities, right? It creates opportunities for organizations to move forward.
Absolutely. When we talked about this as a topic, I thought about a couple of, just simple statements for my own mind. So I think, to me, direct spend is structured and it's measurable. It's tangible goods, there's clear specs and measurable costs. And that's something that goes over the life of the product. Uh, so that is how I would categorize direct spend. Indirect spend, though, or services, or as we've talked about, are more complex. They're people driven, they're intangible, and they're a lot harder to define. But I think that, to your point, that's the exciting part, is that the less structured with services is a greater opportunity to create value. You gotta do a lot of digging to be able to get to it, but when you do, there's a pot of gold, so to speak, at the end of that rainbow. In terms of when you find it, you can action it. It's like, wow, this is unfound wealth here that we didn't that we ignored for such a long time.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I think that kind of leads me on to the kind of key main last area I really wanted to cover with you in this conversation, which is just looking at how the services that organizations procure and that broader approach to services procurement can actually be used as a competitive advantage if it's leveraged properly. And that kind of sits alongside another point that's come to my mind, just based on what you were saying earlier when we were talking about the HR side of it, which is, again, this crossover with workforce. And we can come on to that, but it's almost like a bit of a future question of like, well, who's going to end up owning the overall work capacity and capability of an organization? Is HR going to, expand? Is it going to be a new function? Is it going to be total workforce management, strategic workforce? It's really interesting to see that because this is where orchestration comes into it and real sophisticated coordination, strategic thought, forward planning, all those sorts of things come into it in the sense of organizations have got all these different ways to do work and they need to work out what's the best horse for each course, and actually really learn to kind of push work down through the right channels. So I guess my question to you is really, do you see services procurement as having the potential to be a competitive advantage for organizations? And if so, why? Why do you see that, if that's the case?
I do see it as a competitive advantage. I'm not quite sure. Well, I think the reason I think it's a competitive advantage is for just what we talked about. It's messy. When you can get your arms around data, benchmarking, those types of things that clarify what services sourcing is about, that I think will be very helpful to be able to define where that function sits. And the reason I say that is that when I look at the travel industry, I've been involved with the travel industry for 20 years before getting into contingent labor. It always fell into indirect. It was always messy. And while I think that it's also becoming one of those categories that needs a different place to sit, it's going to depend on the maturity of the sourcing and procurement function. So I'm in LinkedIn. I'm happy to see a lot of messages come through from CPOs about what their commitment to AI is. But what I don't see is their commitment to looking at services procurement differently. So that maturity of in thinking of the CP at the CPO CFO level as to where this should sit, I think is a conversation for down the road. And I think it's going to take one to get rid of the conversation about procurement operations when the majority of that is in AI. Then what's left? It's that what's left that could be restructured into a different functional group, either under a CFO because there's still a financial impact, under a CPO who's has the forward thinking about looking at this kind of eliminating the silos that are kind of created in the structure now and bringing them up into standalone. And that's not the right word, but into their own functional glory.
Right.
A travel program, one that has a sourcing component, but probably more to the point is recognition for the management after. At BP, I had responsibility to manage the travel program. I worked closely with the sourcing function, and they literally sat next to me, but it still felt segregated. At GE, I had responsibility for sourcing and the program management. Once the sourcing was done, we spent the majority of our time on managing the program, the managing the suppliers, the QBRs, the forward-thinking strategic sessions that we would plan for our next year and what their future looks like. How do we embrace their future as part of our future? So I think that view of a program that includes sourcing is probably a good way to look at it, regardless of where it sits in the organization. If it's in procurement because of the function, great. If it sits in HR, contingent labor, for example, total talent management sits in HR, great. But it needs a home that's going to be appreciated for what it can do for the company.
Yeah, I love it. Having been involved in workforce stroke procurement related technology my whole career, I just find the way that how organizations do work, the way that's changed over the last 15, 20 years is absolutely fascinating. And the idea of who's responsible for that and how organizations get their arms around it and make those decisions effectively is something that I think is evolving at a really rapid pace now. When we came into kind of pre-COVID and during COVID, there was this whole kind of explosion of like gig style working. And suddenly people were working remotely as a bit more of a norm and things like that. The gig component has kind of was a burst up and has kind of quietened down a bit. It's still a component, but the services element is like this juggernaut that has drawn from some of the others. And I think one of the interesting observations I've seen around AI is it drives outputs. It drives an output mentality because ultimately, if you hire me and you're paying me based on time, then what I could do pre AI in 5 days, post AI, I might be able to do in 3 days. So is time the best measure of your engagement with me, however I'm engaged, or is it actually what I'm delivering that's the most important thing? So I think this growth of this output, outcome, deliverable mentality is something that's inevitable, and definitely we're seeing a big shift in that. Um, and it's already a fundamental part of how organizations get work done because it ties in with all the stuff that's outsourced to third party suppliers. And I just think that for me is where the wake up call is not just for CPOs, but for CEOs and the entire C suite to say, if your competitors are leveraging their service supply chain more effectively than you, more cost effectively with better relationships, better visibility on capabilities and skills, more ability to flex and manage where capacity has fluctuations. If they're doing that better than you, you're going to lose as an organization because you're not going to be able to deliver the actual work output that you need to compete with them in delivering your service or your product to your customers. And for me, that's the thing that's where the penny really drops with organizations, where they realize that this is absolutely strategic. It's not something that's just kind of like, oh, a bit annoying or that's how we've always done it. It's like, if you don't shape up, you're going to get overtaken pretty quickly, in my opinion. Um,
Well, I think that there's to align with what you just said, the CFO needs to look closely at his organization as well. Because back to that conversation on where the budgets sit, if there is no change in where that budget sits, it'll still be in the details. Everything that we've talked about will be in the details. We'll have data, but that engineering leader, for example, will have responsibility for their budget with no visibility on the outcome of it, except for how he performed to manage his budget. So I think finance needs to look at really closely as to how much flexibility is needed when it comes to sourcing resources, services, and does it fall in an individual functions budget or is it managed differently at the budget level under the CFO. So I think that there's a correlation, and most CPOs that I have come across do have either direct reporting relationship with CFO. But I think there's got to be an evolution in the way CFOs look at their business as well to support what we're talking about in a kind of an evolutionary progression for procurement organizations.
Yeah, look, I love it. It's always brilliant to chat to you about this sort of stuff, Betty. Your wealth of experience looking across different scenarios, different industries, that whole kind of procurement versus contingent workforce angle, and understanding it from a strategic point of view. I always find it really fascinating because you've got a really good strategic view of this. And I know
Thank you.
and I know sometimes it's frustrating when some parts of the business don't move quick enough or with people aren't on the kind of like advanced wavelength. But there's some really interesting change happening in the market. And I think the sort of stuff that you've worked on is very much a part of that. And that's you've worked in the areas where the exciting change is happening. What's the focus for you for the future? Obviously, you've got the experience on, and this is where it kind of crosses over into one to a certain extent because services can quite often sit under contingent workforce effectively. But for you going forwards, in terms of where your real interests and passions lie, what's the focus for you for the future?
Well, so I'm in the job seeker mode. And so I'm looking for roles that particularly have a couple of things in common. One, I want to go back to working for a company and manage the indirect function. To be able to put some more of these kinds of ideas that we've talked about and that I've been exposed to in other companies and play for them. The other part of it, though, is kind of the excitement that you get when you see different industries at work with clients. So consulting is something I'm considering, as well as continuing leadership and maybe even focused leadership in either indirect contingent labor or back into travel. I find all of those very interesting, and travel, in my opinion, travel and labor rule the world. You can't.
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
when either labour or travel get disrupted, we certainly notice it, don't we? We
yeah.
certainly do, and very very pertinent at the moment, kind of in both on both sides. But I think fantastic opportunities for you to get involved with some really transformative stuff in any of those areas, really, and some really great commonalities across them in terms of where you've driven that kind of transformation previously. So. Yeah, I'll be watching that with interest to see what you decide to push into next. But it's brilliant to catch up. I really appreciate you taking the time to discuss this. And thanks very much for sharing your experiences because I think, as we've spoken about before, that's the thing that's useful for other people who are maybe thinking about this, wrestling with these type of issues, hesitant about it, wondering if other people are having the same problems. I think it's very interesting for folk in the industry, practitioners to kind of hear stories from people like yourself and hear the approaches and the issues and how you've resolved them and what your kind of expectations are for the future and what you think is going to change. Because the more conversation that happens around this sort of stuff, the more transformation can happen. And it takes people like yourself to speak up about it. So I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for the time. It was fun. So this is my first podcast, as I had mentioned to you. So you made it painless. Thank you.
Well, you're an absolute natural. It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, Betty. And yeah, no doubt we will speak again soon.
Okay, thank you.